Okay, welcome everyone to Roosevelt House. I'm really pleased to be here on behalf of American Abstract Artists. We have many people to thank today for this event being able to happen, among them Hunter College and Stephen Rose of the Alice Trumbull Mason and Emily Mason Foundation. We also have our esteemed panelists to thank, our moderator, Tom McGlynn, Will Heinrich, Thomas McKelly, Dr. Barbara Staley, and Cecily Kahn. I'd like to just give a short introduction, and then we'll move on to Tom, who has questions for the panelists. So Alice Trumbull Mason is a very important figure in our organization. She was one of the founders of American Abstract Artists in 1936. She was a treasurer in 1939, secretary 1940 to 1945, and president from 1959 to 1963. At her invitation, she brought many prominent artists to the AAA community, among them Piet Mondrian, whose birthday, coincidentally, is today. I'm going to introduce our panelists now in alphabetical order. Will Heinrich was born in New York and spent his early childhood in Japan. He writes about art and artists for the New York Times and has also written for the New Yorker, the New York Observer, Hyperallergic, Art in America, Jewish Currents, and The Nation. His novel, The King's Evil, published by Scribner in 2003, won a Penn Robert Bingham Fellowship in 2004, and was just reissued in London by Thousand Horsemen Press, which will also bring out a collection of stories from darkness to darkness next summer. He has a BA in Japanese from Columbia and an MFA from Bard College. Cecily Kahn received a BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and then spent 2 years in Italy studying experimental etching techniques. She has maintained a studio on Canal Street and Broadway in Manhattan since 1986, and her work was represented by Lowen-Gadul Gallery in Chelsea. She currently lives in Maine with her husband and has 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Cecily serves on the board of the Emily Mason Alice Trumbull Mason Foundation and is a founding member of the advisory board of the Painting Center in New York City. She has been an active member of the American Abstract Artists since 1998 and has served on the membership, grants, and exhibition committees, contributed to the journals, and participated in their exhibitions. Cecily's grandmother was Alice Trumbull Mason, a founding member of the American Abstract Artists. Alice served as both treasurer from 1940 to 1945 and then president. Cecily remembers Alice until her death in 1972 at the age of 68. She is proud to follow Alice Trumbull Mason's footsteps in supporting fellow abstract artists. Our moderator, Tom McGlynn, is an artist and writer based in the New York City area. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian, among other national and international collections. He is currently an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail, contributing articles and criticism since 2012. He also currently teaches at Parsons, the New School, New York City, and in June 2024, he had his first one-person exhibition in Europe at Saint-Antoto Gallery in Ghent, Belgium. He opened his 4th solo show at Rick Wester Fine Art, New York City, in October 2025. Thomas McKelly is an artist and writer. His paintings, sculptures, and drawings have been shown in solo and group exhibitions at such venues as John Davis Gallery, Hal Brahm Gallery, Centotto, Pocket Utopia, Janet Kernatowski Gallery, Studio 10, and Norte Mar. He has been twice selected in 2025 and 26 as a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome. He has published more than 400 reviews, essays, and interviews, and has served as an editor at Hyperallergic and the Brooklyn Rail. He has written catalog essays for galleries and museums locally and internationally, and has contributed to books focused on subjects as diverse as Alice Trumbull Mason, Red Grooms, Matt Friedman, and Maria Bussmann. He has lectured and given critiques at Pratt Institute, Hunter College, the School of Visual Arts, the Maryland Institute College of Art, Old Dominion University, the Rhode Island School of Design, and Rutgers University. And finally, Dr. Barbara Steele is a New York-based art historian and independent curator publishing on architecture and women's contributions to the art historical field. She is the founder of Arts Intelligentsia and teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design. Her exhibitions have been reviewed in the New York Times and Art Forum, among other publications. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
First of all, I want to thank the American Abstract Artists for putting together this panel to talk about my grandmother's work. I also want to thank Kathleen Granados for assembling the materials for me, all of the contributors to the Alice Trumbull Mason book, the Emily Mason, Alice Trumbull Mason Foundation for their support, and Tom McGlynn for moderating. I remember my grandmother as a loving and playful granny. She was delighted by the mischievous curiosity of childhood and loved us dearly. Having said that, I realize that Melanie and I only knew her during the final decade of her life when she succumbed to alcoholism, so it wasn't her best time. Alice Trumbull Mason was born the fifth of six children, 1904, on a farm in Litchfield, Connecticut. Her childhood was comfortable. Art was part of the family heritage. The painter John Trumbull was her great-grandfather. She was particularly close with her artistic older sister, Margaret, with whom she traveled several times overseas. On one of these voyages, Alice met my grandfather, Captain Warwood Mason, a handsome young shipmate. They fell in love and got married in 1930. They settled in Manhattan and had two children, Emily, Mom, and then Jonathan in 1933. By this time, Alice had been painting for a while. She was passionate about ancient Greek and Italian art. And after a course with Arshile Gorky in New York, 1927-28, she knew that she wanted to be an abstract painter. Being a single mother while Warwood was away months at a time couldn't have been easy. In fact, Alice had to take a break from painting for about 2 years, 1932-34, to be a full-time mother. I can imagine the solitude of being a new mother as well as an abstract artist trying to find her voice in an unsympathetic art world. She had met Ilya Bolotowski, Ibram Lassow, Balcom Gertrude Green, and other early AAA members during her academic studies in New York. In 1936, they formed a group and began their discussions. The first meetings took place at Green's studio on 17th Street and were quite well attended by about 30 artists. A group formed to protest the lack of American abstract art being shown in American museums. The only American art shown by museums at that time was regionalist realism. Abstraction belonged to the Europeans. The first group gesture was to picket the Museum of Modern Art for lack of support and representation. We found a letter that Granny wrote to my mother in college that illustrates the uphill battle they had against the critics at the time. Emily Dear, I heard a wonderful program Monday on QXR. Wish I had a recording of it, but I'll tell it best I can. A person named Alma Dettinger has a chit-chat half hour called Everybody's Business. She advertises a lot. Monday, she was shifted from her morning hour to 2:30 p.m., an hour ahead of time. The announcer mentioned this and said that in order to start off the new hour, she had on her program Frederick Taubes and G.L.K. Morris, president of the American Abstract Artists. It turned out that Taubes was her guest, and the Museum of Modern Art has asked Morris to defend the museum's point of view. Well, finally, Alma stopped gabbing and asked Taubes to speak first. So that clown began by saying all abstract art looked like the enlarged hind legs of a louse. He went on like that for quite a bit before George had a chance to get in. Dimorphism? Both were shouting at the same time for a while. Once George said, "Aha, I have you, Mr. Taubes." For all that world likes a Peter Arno joke. All Taubes has been saying was that he liked and didn't like. Once he said he liked Bach, and George said that Bach had not been liked or understood by his contemporaries, much like the American abstract artists of today. Things calmed down a little, and George read, I think, a gracious, intelligent statement on abstract art. Then Taubes got all broken up and said he guessed he shouldn't be on the program at all. George said, "Come on, you surely can answer something." And Alma urged him, and he turned quite vicious, saying abstract artists can't draw, etc. If making portraits, they couldn't get a nose straight, and so on. George answered that, well, and obviously that straight noses often exist in a vacuum. Any errors show up worse in abstract art than in realism. Lots more was said. Taubes tried to get George L.K. to say who was a good abstract artist. George said, "You can't trap me that way." T said Picasso, and G slapped the museum by answering he detests all of Picasso's work since he slid away from the abstract approach in his work 1914-16. Then Alma obviously felt that Taubes, her guest, had too much the work of the argument and invited him to close the talk since he had begun it. George didn't let them get away with that. He interrupted to say, "So Mr. Taubes can close this talk with louse or lice as he began it?" Alma said, "Shh, you'll have me shut off the air for using that word so often." Taubes' final remark was, "I don't like abstract art." So that just shows how, what they were up against. I have the next slide. So this is spring 1931, 20 by 26 inches. It's an early piece. Next is Broken Cadence. It's oil on wood, 1942, 26 by 22 inches. Next, please. And this is The Seed is White, 1951, oil on wood panel, 24 by 24. And so this is a statement that Alice wrote. The problem is the canvas itself and the organization of the canvas. Of course, I realize that realistic painters face the same problem too, but in a much more superficial manner than abstract artists do, because they can deceive you. But when you're faced with only the canvas and the colors and what you're placing on that canvas, then you have a tremendous proposition to face, much less deceptive, let us say, than realistic painting. It's the true realism, in case anybody is interested to know. Next. Okay. And this is Barbary Hedge, 1954, oil on canvas, 22 by 24, 24 by 22 inches. And that's at the Sheldon Museum of Art. And then finally, the White Shafts of Trinity, next slide, 1969. This is a painting we grew up with. It's only 16 by 10 inches. But it was sort of her highly synthesized late architectural abstract period. And next slide is Granny and Ibrahim Lasso at a party. She was very close with him for many years. And finally, next slide is a pendant that Ibrahim made for Granny. And we still have. So that's about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Cicely. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
So our next presenter is Barbara.
Can I actually use this mic? So it's easier, I don't have to hold it. Hi, everybody. Hi. I'm actually going to start with a moment of an homage to American abstract artist group and women. If you can go back to an image of the image of Ibrahim and Alice together, so we can get that one. Yeah, and then we'll jump onto hands up. So I wanted to take a moment to give an homage to Abstract American Artist Group for what they've done for women in abstraction. When the group was founded, they took women in just like they did men. And that was an attitude that was very unusual for the time, to say the least. Out of 39 founding members, 9 were women, amongst them Ray Eames and Alice Trumbull Mason. The women in the group gave back just as much as AAA gave them. And one can say that for Mason, this was a work of dedication all throughout her life. Kim mentioned she was a treasurer, she was a president eventually. The first president of American Abstract Group was actually Charmian van Wingen, as a woman, the first woman president, I should say, in 1951, and then Mason followed in 1959. During the time that Trumbull Mason lived, the female word was an F word in the in the art world, and she was worse. She was also a mother, and that was something that the art world could not accept. If you had children, you were considered a not professional artist, pretty much. There's this terrible anecdote that Emily Mason actually tells when she was 2 months pregnant with you. I think she was speaking to, I'm going to skip who she was speaking to, but the woman said, how long ago are you? And she said 2 months. And she said, oh, you still have time to get an abortion. And Emily goes on saying, you know, people didn't have, artists didn't have children because they couldn't afford it very often. And then if they did, it was kind of suicide for a woman to do that in terms of her profession. Emily continues about Alice saying, when she asked Alice, what do you feel like being a woman played against you? And Emily gets this answer from Alice. She felt left out of the success her male peers received because she was a woman. She was quite aware that it was the men of the American abstract artists who got to show in the galleries. My mother was very close to Ilya Bolotowski. They spent every New Year's together, and Ilya was taken on by Grace Borknecht, the gallerist, but Grace wouldn't have any women painters on the roster. It was a real stigma. AAA was a place where the art world rules were bent a bit, and the artist Alice Adams remembers meeting Alice Trumbull Mason and Charmian Van Wegen. These women and all the members of the group seemed genuinely interested in one another's life's work, she says. It was very different from what I experienced in the competitiveness of the art world. Yet the associations that women had at AAA didn't translate beyond the walls, especially for mothers. Mason had 2 children. Group shows were what she was offered, but for a few exceptions. During her lifetime, Trumbull Mason struggled commercially. Emily Mason recalls, and I love that anecdote, my father used to invent sales for her and pay income taxes on it so he could deduct materials. She used to go to the Baroness Hilary Bay and get $15 a month. But nothing softened Alice's focus and her drive to create. She knew, she said to her daughter, I'll be famous when I'm dead. Can I have the slide with Mondrian? This one, yeah. So it's Mondrian's birthday. And so let's have a moment for him. This is not a Mondrian, and it is the only painting by another artist that belonged to Alice Trumbull Mason, i.e. a fake, one that she had made herself, a copy of Mondrian. And it's a copy of a painting she had seen in 1951 at Sydney Janis Gallery. And it says on the back of it, I measured the work in a gallery and painted from memory. I believe the original is in Switzerland. She was right, it's in Basel. And the painting is, de Mondrian, is a painting from 1932 called Double Line and Yellow and Gray. Mason defined her personal inclination toward an architectural abstract art as a choice to make painting a positive architectural construction. And in that way, she was inspired by Mondrian, even though Mondrian himself didn't speak about an architectural art, but he saw painting as preparation for future architecture. His coming to New York confirmed his intuitions and were reflected in Broadway Woogie Boogie that we all know. And it's in 1940, when Mondrian came to New York, that Mason met him, and he joined AAA. And he became an admired friend of Alice Trumbull Mason. This is what she says about him. Mondrian was the dearest, kindest, most wonderful person you ever saw in your life. He came to our meetings, and he wrote for us, and he was deeply interested in the work we were doing. And her daughter, Emily, remembers meeting Mondrian, and she knew that he had a very special status when the kids, her and her brother, were asked to be very polite and keep quiet, something that they were never asked to be when around anybody else. And so they knew he was really special. Can I have the next slide? So Mondrian was an inspiration, and Alice had a first phase of biomorphism, and then her architectural structure took over, and she kind of committed to that. And we spoke about the fact that it was very difficult for her to find representation, and it's finally when she met Richard Bellamy that for a moment she had a little bit of support by a steady gallery in New York City. And this is a show at the Henza Gallery that we have the announcement for. And the director of the Henza at the time was Richard Bellamy. this is the announcement, and it's interesting because it looks a little bit like a 1923 Weimar, Bauhaus cover with the intersecting lines. Could I have the next slide? The one with the Hansa, that one. Yes, thank you. So this is, we don't have many photographs of solo shows of Alice and their installation, but this is one that we have, and I have to thank the foundation for providing it for me. On the announcement, I forgot to say there was a little poem written, and it's a poem by Alice, and it's a very mysterious sounding poem that refers to the sea and the feeling that something is off, and then one is left disoriented. A year before the show at the Hansa, Alice Trumbull Mason had experienced the most drastic loss of her life with her son Joe found dead at sea, either by accident or by suicide. He was 25 years old. She would never get to know what really happened. Thus, maybe that feeling of disorientation and of loss quoted in a poem. Her husband had been a sea captain and the sea had bored him for years, but never stolen him. And here it was, her son gone. The artist struggled with depression and a deep grief that sunk her into alcoholism. And she ended up at the Charles B. Towns Hospital on Central Park West, a place on the Upper East Side that understood that addiction was a sickness and needed to be treated as such. Apparently, there were 2 floors for alcoholics, one for patients determined to quit, and another for those who weren't. This is where Mason and Richard Bellamy met on that floor. It is strange how life brings people together. Dick was 31, a tad older than her lost son, and Mason was 54. Both were passionate about art and poetry. Bellamy was odd, irreverent, outlandish, but as Castelli said, there was nobody who was not enchanted with Bellamy. Mason loved them, and Emily Mason recalls, they were birds of a feather. They both had a unique look on the world. They were outside the box. They always made me feel so practical compared to them. Bellamy and Trumbull Mason had fun together. And out of the hospital, Bellamy gave a show at the Hansa Gallery. The Hansa was the second co-op set up in New York in 52 on 12th Street. By 55, Bellamy was the director and they had moved uptown. One of the founder of the Hansa Group was Wolf Kahn, Emily Mason's son-in-law. Bellamy was not interested in Kahn's art. That also was a common point with Alice. Alice famously had objected to Emily's getting married to Wolf because he was a figurative artist. So in 1955, when they were uptown, Dick Bellamy puts together this show, and you have on screen works that are the best that she had at the time. The one that you have here is memorial. It's in honor to her son, Joe. It's now at the Whitney Museum. And the one over there on the right is also at the Whitney Museum. And it's called Pale Column. So the Hansa eventually closed that same year after an Alan Capro very famous display. And Dick Bellamy would continue his commitment to Alice when he opened the Green Gallery in 1960. I wanted to say before that 1959 ended up being a good year for Alice. As Kim said, she also became the president of AAA that year. And it is really thanks to Bellamy and to AAA's support that I feel that this woman was able to grieve her son's death in a very meaningful manner. So after the Hansa Gallery closed, Bellamy met Robert Scull, a taxi mogul and art collector who wanted to fund a new gallery, and he backed Bellamy to open the Green Gallery on 57th Street. Bellamy continued to commit to Alice's work. The program was eclectic. She was part of some group shows. There's still more research to do about that and exactly all the dates and all of that. But we have, could I have the next slide? This one. So this work and the next one that are part of the last series of Alice, so-called the shutter paintings that Will is going to speak about, were consigned to the Green Gallery and to Bellamy with other works from that period. There is a list that we have of all the works that went in, and in an interview, Wolf Kahn, who didn't seem to hold grudges so strongly, said that Dick actually sold 2 paintings by Alice. On the records, we can see that one went to the Hirshhorn, even though I couldn't find it in the Hirshhorn collection, and another one to a private collection. So that's for Bellamy. And she, when he showed her and he said that, and Wolf Kahn says that Alice had a solo show at the Green, which we're still trying to figure out when. When she was in group shows, she must have been for sure the oldest. The crew that was shown there was the younger people. And it's interesting to see Alice again and again being surrounded by her youngest contemporaries. I'm surprised she was never a teacher because she got along with the youth so beautifully. She had a very strong connection to Ray Johnson and Richard Lippold. And finally, when the Green Gallery closed in '65, works were returned to her, and she was never to find somebody who committed to her work in the same manner, and she was left with the American Abstract Artist Group as her main community after Bellamy faded out. Thank you. The last image, if you can move forward. I have one more image that I wanted to show, another one. This is, again, another painting that was at the Green Gallery on consignment. And the next one, can I have just the next one? So we have only a black and white picture, but this is the painting, Hot Edge, that was given to Bellamy and as a gift by Alice, and it's very pastel colors. It's a beautiful painting, light blue and light yellow.
Thanks very much for the great historical context. Next, we have Tom Michelli.
Thanks, Tom. I want to start by thanking Kim and Tom and Christian for organizing this, and Steve from the foundation. I also want to thank Elisa Wook Amino, who is on the West Coast, can't be here. Thanks. But she was responsible. She was the editor of the Rizzoli book, and she enlisted Will and myself to write for it. So shout out to Elisa. My essay was about Alice Trumbull Mason and contemporary art. And what I'm going to do is expand on my essay somewhat. The essay was actually written in 2018. It seems like a lifetime ago. And so much has happened since then that when I reread it, it almost seemed quaint. But anyhow, what the thrust of the essay was that Alice Trumbull Mason. I begin with a critique of her a posthumous Whitney show by Hilton Kramer, who kind of dismissed the work as not having a signature style, and I took off from that as that it actually was a plus, and it was more forward-looking than Kramer had any idea it would be, and that it was a much more open way of making art. The next, my first slide. No, that's it. Okay. I divided my talk into four categories, and it's going to be a bit of a collage of quotations from. There's really three sources on Alice Trumbull Mason. There's a 1969 interview for the Archives of American Art by Ruth Gurin. There is a I think either master's or bachelor's thesis by the photographer Lona Foote, who's in 1977, City College of New York. Her thesis advisor was the artist Sherman Drexler, who's the husband of Rosalind Drexler, just to put all that into context. And then there was a 1982 catalog essay by Marilyn Brown titled Two Generations of Abstract Painting, Alice Trumbull Mason, Emily Mason. So it was a two-person exhibition of mother and daughter. Just to have a bit of a biographical introduction, just 2 seconds. She was born, as Cicely said, in 1904. That makes her an exact contemporary with Willem de Kooning, Clifford Still, Adolf Gottlieb, and Arshile Gorky, who was her teacher. So they were both like 26 years old in they were like 24 years old in 1927, 28, when he was her teacher during his Neo-Cezanne period. But he was the one who introduced her to European modernism. And she said about that in her interview, he really opened my eyes to abstract art, though he wasn't very strongly abstract at the time. He contradicted himself every day, but I knew he wanted to express something. From then, I came to believe that for me, abstract art was the best way to express myself. So now you have Alice Trumbull Mason anchored at the very beginning of the 20th century. And we tend to think, at least when I was training as an artist and gathering all the information I could, I always felt that the pre-war American abstract artists were kind of, I don't know, way back in time, but to realize that they were absolutely contemporary with the abstract expressionists, I think reveals something about the politics, the aesthetics, et cetera, of the time. And the avant-garde at the time, because when Marcel Duchamp made Bicycle Wheel in 1913, she was 9 years old. So the avant-garde was already galloping ahead when she was a child. And so Marcel Duchamp, in a talk at MoMA in 1961, called Apropos of Ready-Made, said, in 1913, I had the happy idea to fasten a bicycle wheel to a kitchen stool and watch it turn. I don't think I introduced this category or chapter of my talk. This is activation by the viewer. And it's a radical idea that became very closely linked to Duchamp. In 1957, he wrote a short essay called The Creative Act, in which he says, let us consider two important factors, the two poles of the creation of art, the artist on one hand, and on the other, the spectator who later becomes the posterity. This phenomenon is comparable to a transference from the artist to the spectator in the form of an aesthetic osmosis taking place through the inert matter such as pigment, piano, or marble. All in all, the creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act. Now, I just want to make a caveat that the things I'm going to say about Alice Trumbull Mason are not to suggest that her work, her ideas were influential because she was so obscure in her lifetime, or predictive I just want to bring out how her work was embedded in the currents of the time and how the currents continued on and developed into the contemporary world that we now know. And I did it in a way that seems bluntly literal at times. But one thing that I found very fascinating about her work was what she called four-way balance. In her essay, Lona Foote writes, her paintings and prints in the 1940s began increasingly to be informed by her investigations of balance, and specifically her strategy of four-way balance, in which direction and displacement are at once indicated through transposition and integration of forms by the turning of the canvas as the composition is being developed. Now, we're all artists. We all know that we were trained to occasionally turn the canvas around. If you're a painter, turn the canvas around, look at it upside down, look at it sideways, look at it different light to get a sense of how it's all working together. But she took it a step further, and she, skip over that, and she, where are we? This painting here is called, it's called Emergent Form, and she signed it in the top left corner and the bottom right corner. I blew up and drained the color and bumped up the contrast so you could kind of see her signature in the top left. You can't really see it so well in the bottom right, but I believe the top says ATM and the date, and I believe the bottom says Mason. And so it's not like she signed it along the edge. Whenever she double signed something, it was kind of jammed into the corner so that it could work this way or that way, and then the other side it could work that way or this way. Now, the idea of the owner or the collector taking the work off the wall and changing it to suit his or her preferences is a radical idea that began. I couldn't find a precedent for it, quite frankly, in two-dimensional art, and she the act of doing that seems to fuse both Mondrian in terms of his ideas of dynamic balance and Duchamp, two very polar artists. But there was also a sense of idealism in this work, in which, as Foote writes, Alice Mason, along with many of the artists of her time, took very, very dearly the responsibility of the artist to inspire people with a sense of rationality through design, to have examined the values of life and to create an intelligent, universal order and purity. And she adds that personal freedom in color and form gave the viewer a great deal of freedom in the myriad of possible interpretations. So not only, as Duchamp said, the viewer completes the work of art through the viewer's own interpretation, the viewer is actively moving the work of art in a way that would jibe with the viewer's sense of the work of art. And this sense of idealism carried through into very clearly the work of Yoko Ono in the 1960s, her Fluxus work. This is a large version from 1999 of table piece, in which, I'm sorry, not table piece. Excuse me. Play It by Trust. It's a all white chessboard, so no one is. You can't really be opposed to one another. That is a park-size version of it, and other works by Yoko Ono, the famous Grapefruit book or Cut Piece, were all the they were all very much involved with the viewer as a participant, and of course, Abramovich's The Artist is Present would not be possible without the viewer. The next slide, which I'll skip through quickly, Anselm Kiefer on the top. I had the opportunity to interview him when at the press preview of Kiefer Rodin at the Barnes Foundation, and he told me that he looks upon his work as a continuum. And if he's having a show, he grabs a bunch of stuff and shows it. And then when the show is done, he just throws it back into the studio and then works it on again. So it's constantly moving. Philida Barlow, the same type of artist. Everything is a continuum. Everything is moving. And Alice Trumbull Mason did works in series. The series sometimes were years long. She often had different series going on in different parts of the house. And these paintings are called, they're part of a series called Bearings in Transition. It's Bearings in Transition, Bearings in Transition 2, an integration of bearings. We can run to the next one. This this set of slides has to do with material and how the materials that Alice Trumbull Mason used were really the source of her ideas. Marilyn Brown, the writer, used the phrase the self-generating and self-referential palpability of the medium. And she often made drawings for her work, which actually Gorky did too, and then transformed it into paint. This particular one, called Latitude of Identical Shapes, was created through collage, and the collage became the template for the drawing, and then the drawing became the template for the painting. But if you've probably all seen her work, you know that there is a skin and a body to her paint, so that it's an extremely different type of experience from looking at a drawing. And I know I'm over time, but I will quickly go to the last one. I'm okay? All right. And this is the idea of transhistorical form. Alice Trumbull Mason was very affected by the art of Cimabue. She, in fact, said that I believe that if Giotto, great as he was, had not turned his back away from his master Cimabue to realism, art would be several centuries ahead of our present position. The drawing is from her notebooks, and I am speculating here, but I believe that this may be the one cited in the literature that she drew from a Cimabue drawing in the Uffizi. And what is remarkable about the Cimabue, the drawing from Cimabue, is the way that the forms are then transferred geometrically to the painting Memorial, which she did in 1957, 58, I'm sorry, 58, 59, about the death of her son. And the last image is from the current show at the Museum of Modern Art by Odile Donald Odita, called Songs from Life. And I included that not only because of the uncanny similarity of his geometric forms to Alice Trumbull Mason's shutter paintings, but also the idea that anyone who does an installation like that is, in a sense, creating a sacred space, which I feel goes back to the churches where Alice Trumbull Mason in the 1920s found her inspiration. That's it.
Next, we have Will Heinrich.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. So I wanted to talk about one particular consistent aspect that I see in Alice Trumbull Mason's painting. Part of what makes her, did I just put that closer to my mouth, or did someone turn the volume up? Part of what makes her achievement as a painter so impressive is its sheer variety. If you look at a painting of hers from the 30s and compare it to one from the 60s, you could, at first glance, think they were done by different people, but obviously it would be easy to do superficial variety. I could do a Damien Hirst dot painting today and a Renoir tomorrow, and that would be very various, but it wouldn't mean anything because there'd be nothing holding them together, no sort of coherence. What's impressive in the case of Mason's painting is that there are things holding all these different expressions together. It's also impressive that she achieved so much variety in what is a relatively narrow lane, I would say. It's a particular type of abstraction. It's not driven by gesture. The edges are relatively clean always, but she gets a tremendous amount out of it, but there's something that holds it all together. In the monograph, I wrote about what I proposed was a kind of vortex-like composition that many of her paintings have. But what I wanted to talk about here is a quality that, depending on how you feel about it, you might call energy or dissonance or tension, a kind of unresolved quality, even a chaos that characterizes the paintings. I picked 4 and I put them in a chronological order just for convenience, but I think you could do this with any 4 paintings of hers in principle. So if we could, we have my first slide. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to break the format a little bit, so instead of me talking at you, we're all looking at the painting at the same time together. There's a lot happening in this painting. There's a lot of lines. There's a lot of shapes, and there's a very vivid sense of motion because there's all these loops and lines going in all directions at the same time, but there's not quite any clear narrative, by which I mean there's no sequential change that happens from one place to the other. If you start, what draws my eye first is this kind of canoe shape in the upper right hand corner. That's what draws my eyes. It's very vivid. These maroon on gray stripes in the bottom part of the canoe are almost vibrating with a kind of tension, but they're also, obviously, it's a painting. They're static in a certain sense. I want to follow one of the lines. To me, it seems to go down. I'm going to start at the top and follow that big swoop, whether it's the bottom of a canoe cutting through the water or it's like the slash of a sword or something. You follow it down with your eye, and then where does it take you? It takes you into a dark abyss, or maybe you follow the line further and like a skier and you launch off into a white void. It doesn't take you anywhere, really. Or if you look at that line and you take it in the other direction, you go up, you hit the edge, there's that sort of wiggly line of dirty toothpaste almost crossing off your destination, crossing out the entire action. You don't you don't get anywhere. There's a lot happening, but you don't get anywhere. And then if you consider the colors similarly, the colors are kind of evenly distributed, the palette. You have this red kind of, I hope none of the abstract artists in the room mind that I make these figurative comparisons. I find it a handy way to talk about shapes. I mean no offense, but if you look at the kind of cartoon coyote on the left is red. You have the warm orange glow on the bottom right hand. You have some more orange glow in the middle, orange at the top left. There's some kind of reddish orange everywhere around the painting. There's some kind of pea soup yellowish green in the top right corner, on the bottom, up on the above on the left also. They're like all the colors of her palette are evenly distributed around the canvas. But again, you couldn't, there's a sort of cigarette smoke, bluish gray, but you can't quite say that they all arrive at a harmony exactly. You can't say they arrive at anything singular quite. I mean, for me, if I had to choose, I would say the overall effect of the painting is kind of in that dried blood, reddish orange color, but not quite. There's enough yellow to disrupt that impression. There's enough white. There's enough blue to disrupt that impression. And then similarly, if you look at the modeling, the grading of the color, if you look at in the upper left, the bluish gray, what I'm calling cigarette smoke, it fades from darker to lighter from left to right, which evokes something like a sense of depth, but doesn't really take you anywhere. It's not quite a sense of depth. Or in the bottom, the darker from right to left, going in the opposite direction. It doesn't, it feels like depth, but it doesn't take you anywhere. And then you have the little circles, the squiggles, everything complicating things. It's kind of creating something from nothing. Everything, everywhere you look, is a kind of a struggle or a tension, as if she's making all this appear from nowhere. And it sounds as if I'm describing it like an action painting, but it really isn't, because there's also this a very clear, to me, there's a very clear balance between the freedom of gesture and the control of composition or organization, which you could take in a number of ways. You could take it as a balance between ego and id, for example. You could take it as a balance between different approaches to using the paintbrush. But again, there's just enough of each to make you feel that there's a contest happening, and it's a contest without a final resolution. If you look a decade later at the next slide, please, integration of bearings, it's kind of tempting to treat this as a transitional compromise between two different types of shapes she's using. And you can almost see what I noted down as velvet blankets of anxiety in the background that have been crossed out or covered over with this hard edge rain of clean rectangles. But you could also interpret it as a kind of gloss. In other words, a dictionary that tells you how to understand the rectangles in terms of the blobs, or vice versa, how these different ways of making shapes and colors on the canvas get at the same fundamental affect or idea. So to the degree that you can see what's happening with the blobs behind the rain, there's a similar thing happening to the first untitled painting from the late 30s. The colors are evenly distributed. You have the cigarette smoke color in the upper left and the bottom right corner. You have the pea soup at the top, at the bottom left. A little tiny corner, a little tiny bit of it in the bottom right. They're evenly distributed, but again, kind of in an unresolved way. And it almost an image that it made me think of that I noted down is the feeling of two panels leaning against each other. If you imagine two panels balanced against each other, it would be stable. It might be perfectly still, but there's still a sense of precariousness or danger, a sense of potential energy, because it would be so easy to knock them over. the colors connect to each other as well. The brownish red, the dried blood becomes a cleaner or Mondrian-like red. The pea soup becomes a bright yellow, but you see their relationship from one to the other as a kind of evolution. And you also see that the blobs behind the rain wouldn't be a complete painting by themselves. They need something else happening. And so the rectangles start you moving more quickly. There's the movement in the sense of color contrast, as in an Albers color theory diagram. If you look at the red rectangle on the left, at its top, it's against a mostly yellow background. At the bottom, it's against a bluish gray background. But it's all one singular piece, which again takes you from one effect to a very different effect if you follow it with your eyes as a line, but it remains a single piece that you can also take in at once, that kind of tension. There's the sort of indication of motion that all the lines create together from the top left to the bottom right. And as I was thinking about this, I wondered whether an Arabic speaker would experience this the same way. But for me, as a who reads from left to right, moving from the top left to the bottom right feels necessarily like it goes in that direction. But she troubles that feeling of motion or complicates it with a couple of rectangles tilted the other way in the bottom left. You see there's the white one, there's the light blue one. Even that yellow one, the third from the left on the bottom, are tilted back, not exactly like breaks of the motion, but like, tacks thrown in the road to make it more difficult. Can we go on to ionic magnitude? So in 1960, we get to what I guess we're calling the shutter paintings. You see that the color palette remains related to what she was doing. You still see the yellowish green, but red is reduced to only this one thin piece in the middle. You have two whitish, grayish spikes at the bottom. And you have innumerable types of motion and force happening in this painting. Whether you go down the lines or up the lines with your eyes, it's clearly, there's a sensation of speed that you get. And then you begin to have sort of more abstract ambiguity here. You have to decide whether you see these as columns of color with needle-like forms in front of them, or whether you see, for example, the orange piece in the middle being pinched by two blue columns. Whether you see the blackish piece at the right as one quick motion, or you see it as a stripe being compressed and constrained by two gray pieces to either side of it. I would say that however you read it, again, it's a similar balance. She's not giving you the answer. She's placing them, she's painting it in such a way that both possibilities coexist and can't ever be decided between, can't ever be resolved. The longer I spent looking at this, the more it changed, introducing a kind of temporal sense of narrative, maybe. At some point, it switches and you start to see two colored columns. In the middle, you see one that's greener gray and bluer gray to the left, between a black and an orange background, so to speak. It's difficult to distinguish what's in front from what's behind, or which way anything is moving. You can go to the last slide. Am I for time? Okay, good time. Okay. When we get to the saffron pitch, it's evoking, to my eyes, it's evoking so much. It's for one last dip out into the figurative. I think about bed slats or taut strings or even letters. Start to think with the black widening and narrowing pieces in a more distant way. It evokes the pupils of the eye and vision blinking. But again, there's the sense of force and contradiction that can't be resolved, which to my eyes is almost the same as we saw in the untitled painting from 30 or 25 years earlier, sort of the opposite of Mondrian. It's not about harmony, it's about compression and potential energy and force. And if you put it in emotional terms, for me, I would read it as anxiety, but that's maybe my temperament. And that was my thought I had about Alice Trumbull Mason.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for keeping on point at the time. And it's kind of a wonderful progression from a very personal recollection to an art historical contextualization, and then Tom's art historical transition into the critical dialogue, the current critical dialogue, and then I guess I would call yours an ontological unpacking. But
That's very generous.
I think it's a great combination. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So it is Mondrian's birthday, and just before, I'm going to ask everybody to kind of respond to each one of you. But I think you said something very significant, Will, at the end when you said it's actually opposite Mondrian. And I think it's kind of important to make the point that they were operating on kind of two different idealisms. I mean, his was much more of a metaphysical idealism, and Alice Trumbull Mason was more of a pragmatic progress. So she's more related to Peirce, Charles Sanders Peirce, than Madame Blavatsky. I think it's an important distinction to make. I mean, if we talk about abstraction and the fact that the mutability of the form, it's not as fixed as a Greenbergian formalism, that abstraction is about mutability of form. And so I just wanted to say that. Sorry, Pete. But, it's a progression. It's a historical progression. She picked it up and, took it someplace else. But I think Cecily wanted to say something.
Just that I wanted to read a quote from Gertrude Stein, her lecture at MoMA, 1934, before the American Abstract Artists group was formed. And I'm sure Granny went to this lecture. Many of the early members of this organization did. And she said, Gertrude Stein said, the relation between the oil painting and the thing being painted was really nobody's business. It could be the oil painting's business, but actually, for the purpose of the oil painting, after the oil painting was painted, it was not the oil painting's business, and so it was nobody's business. And think of that in 1934, how shocking that sounded, that a painting had its own autonomy, that you had to bring your own something to the painting, that it wasn't just up to a painting to explain itself. And I think that really was a big shock to people.
And also, it's significant that Gertrude Stein studied with William James, so one of the fathers of American pragmatism. But do any of you have any responses to each of your presentations?
I'm not sure if it's a question. I was just struck that of the two gallery directors who were mentioned, one was Grace Borgenicht and one was Richard Bellamy, who each maintained their galleries for decades. And I'm just curious, did your father show with Grace Borgenicht? Yes, that's what I thought.
So did Emily.
So did Emily. Okay. And yet, Richard Bellamy took her on, who was way more avant-garde in his roster. So I just thought that was an interesting point worth making.
Yeah, there were very few women that Bellamy showed, and amongst them was Yayoi Kusama,
Right. Yeah.
and then there was Alice.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's interesting that he's interested in radical art in so many ways, and he chooses this old lady who's decades older than everybody in the show,
Right.
and he supports her till the end. Yeah. So he really saw in her, I think, the modernist link with the avant-garde, with the contemporary avant-garde.
I wanted to add a very brief anecdote that I thought of, Barbara, when you were talking about pregnancy for female artists at the time. I mean, to put my cards on the table, I adore Pete Mondrian, but I think Alice Trumbull Mason should be equally famous and revered. And there's one obvious reason why she isn't. I ran into someone I went to grad school with a couple of years ago, maybe it was 4 years ago. The male member of a couple my wife and I had gone to grad school with, and we were just catching up on the street a little bit. And he told me that his partner was pregnant, and I said, "Oh, congratulations, that's wonderful." And he said, "Oh yeah, but you can tell Irina, but don't tell anyone else because we have to figure out how to contextualize it." So it's still a thing.
Yeah. It's really dramatic. The other quote that Emily has in that interview, she speaks about the fact that even male artists were really tentative in becoming fathers. For the same reason. Like affordability, I think, was a very big thing, but also because they weren't sure how to navigate then as parent, the scene. And she speaks about Hans Hofmann's wife having 5 abortions. And it was really sobering reading these interviews. It really makes you reflect on a little bit more joyful, or I don't know, change the topic because it's so somber. But for Mondrian, I think that Alice revered him so much, and yet I think like with, Theo van Dorsburg, he would have stopped talking to her because of the triangle. I mean, he stopped talking to Theo van Dorsburg because of a diagonal. And the next thing you know is that, Alice is doing all these diagonals and departure from him in a drastic manner in these shutter paintings in the 60s. Yeah.
It's arguable that the Broadway Boogie Woogie was a big departure for
For him too.
Mondrian. It was
Yeah.
like, when he came to the United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Without a diagonal yet.
I mean, yeah, but we have no idea what would have happened if he had lived longer. I have a pet theory. He would have come around to making paintings like Jan Mueller. The boogie woogie, the squares would get smaller and start to get figurative. Kind of work his way all the way back around if he'd lived for another 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, I made the point of that the Greenbergian kind of delimiting of abstraction is historically determinist, and it's just really interesting, to see Alice Trumbull Mason's work kind of transcend that historical determinist narrative almost by default, almost by the fact that she was just doing her own thing. I mean, I don't think that's the optimum situation, but it made me think of a quote by Adolf Gottlieb where he talks about the freedom of abstract artists in America was because and this, this is like in the context of regionalism and stuff, like, is because the society finds no social function for them, for abstraction, and that was the actual essence of the abstract artist freedom. And I think there's something interesting about her work in the sense that, I mean, it is kind of tragic in a way, but or maybe not. I mean, history has a way of coming around, and this might be an example of it. This panel. So just like abstraction, you never know. You know. Does anybody else want to say something?
Mondrian talked a lot about plasticity, whereas Granny talked about, Mondrian talked a lot about plasticity, which is what you were kind of referring to, this equal displacement of forms. I'm really glad you didn't see any lice in Granny's paintings and you only saw canoes.
And a coyote. Cartoon coyote, but yeah.
And my grandmother she talked more about like an architectural abstraction. Just to make.
That's an important distinction. Two different ideas of plasticity.
Right.
One is more mutable. One is more kind of like based on an ideal
Building.
form. Yeah, it's interesting. There's no dividing line between them, but they go back and forth with Alice's work for sure.
Well, she found the term architectural abstraction as a counterweight to abstract expressionism. Didn't she begin to talk about her work as architectural in the as a
relation to-
response to Abeg's, but maybe not before? Well, I mean, she was biomorphic before, but then she had biomorphic and geometric elements in the same painting, which is another thing that I think
Those are the
Hilton
most
Kramer.
interesting for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what Hilton Kramer objected to the most.
I mean, she evolves into architectural abstraction after the death of her son, mostly eliminates biomorphism after that moment. And when you showed the memorial painting, I was glad because that's the one in the Hansa, that is also at the Whitney, and relating the memorial to a monument and to architecture. Also, I think the link there is important, that there is like a construct and that sense also in architecture that there is a space, that it highlights the space as opposed to the object, I think is important in her abstraction, especially for her new way of creating all overs, right? These shapes are going through the painting. And to me, like, to speak about contemporariness, they evoke the contraction, expansion that you speak a bit about, in op art that was also going on at the time, like I think of Bridget Riley, for example, but also fast forward with somebody like Meryl Wagner and the Palisades that she's painting, also because that obsession with yellow, she painted like these wooden palisades. And there is something about that in his paintings. And so she moves toward, I think, something that is really space related and architecturally related without the perspective. And that idea of eliminating the construct of perspective and the depth in the painting, and yet through this abstraction, contraction, creating a sense of interstice, of an in-between is interesting
Well,
to me.
there's a kind of, they always have I think, for me, I think it's partially about the color choices, but there's always something like depth. It's not quite perspective, but they're not surfacey the way an off
Right.
painting is. They're not on the surface the way Bridget Riley is. They have a kind of give to them, or
Yeah.
almost like a visual
There's a weight.
squishiness or something.
Yeah.
It's I mean, to what it looks like to me is the way I think of it, is that there's, you see an awareness of the kind of complication and ambiguity of human experience that comes into the painting, and an inability in a way to, take up Blavatsky and be purely in the ethereal realm somewhere, a kind of, unseverable connection to real life, however clean you make it. And so there isn't anything ever perfectly flat.
I think what you were saying about angst, I mean, there is a certain level of existentialism, I think, in Alice Trumbull Mason, as opposed to a mysticism, which is
Right.
what you're pointing to with Blavatsky. For me, like the absence of mechanical repetition makes the humanity so palpable. And also, we see slides, but these paintings have texture. Their lines are not totally straight. There is a lot of fragility, of vulnerability that is there despite her reserve. And when Emily speaks about her mother, right, and she speaks about how reserved she was, and that expressing was not the thing in the forefront. Even in her daughter's work, she didn't really understand why expressing so much was necessary. And I think that's maybe also why there was this connection with the kind of works that were shown at the Green Gallery that were more hard edge, conceptual, that had that reserve, that were anti-expressionist so clearly. Yeah.
Actually, that's something I wanted to bring up in terms of content, because Marilyn Brown several times talks about how Alice wanted to use an emotional reality as the inspiration for her work. And this is total speculation on my part, but I showed in my last slide, there was the Cimabue Maesta of the mother and child, and then there was the crucifixion, and then there was memorial, which uses the motherhood, death of son, and then the same exact composition. Now, whether or not she carried those formal ideas through the decades since she saw them in her 20s. But I just found it a very striking comparison. And I'm just wondering, well, from your personal experience, from talking with your mother, how where the emotional content might have lay in Alice's work.
There's one more that along the same lines is the one for Botticelli that is like the Nativity, right? Not the Nativity, the Annunciation. So it's all related to family stories and to motherhood, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think they were just very close, and yeah, they were emotionally very close, my mother and Granny. So,
But in the work, she didn't say how it would.
yeah, their work was very different.
Yeah.
I think we're just about ready to go to questions for the audience, but I really want to thank everybody for a really scintillating and in-depth look at the work. And so thank you. So we're going to take questions from the audience.
Yes, I think we can do some questions and then we'll conclude. But I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. Thank our wonderful panel. This is such a stimulating discussion. I won't soon forget. And it's a wonderful way in celebrating Alice Trumbull Mason and her life and work to memorialize also the 90th anniversary of American Abstract Artists, which is this year. And I hope that you'll all join us at our 90th anniversary exhibition at Art Cake, which opens April 11th. More on that later. Would anyone like the mic? Jason?
Thanks, everyone, for this wonderful panel. There was a couple of comments that were made by panelists about, her relative obscurity, when she's working, and some of the speculation about why that might be. And something that struck me, and I'm curious if this might resonate, is how, she moves from that kind of biomorphic abstraction and then goes to these more kind of structural shutter paintings and then that kind of architectural abstraction. And Tom, you mentioned Greenberg, and Greenberg, of course, says that when artists are kind of aesthetically homeless, that they're a little bit less in the conversation as far as he's concerned. When they don't quite have that singular identity, where it's okay, I'm making the drip paintings as Pollock, I'm making just this color field abstraction. She's kind of moving between a lot of modalities, and so I'm curious if you feel like because she doesn't exactly fall squarely somewhere, that might kind of mean that she's tougher to kind of pin down for a lot of people in that moment, and to receive her in some singular kind of way that others or peers might have.
Well, I think she was kind of in the middle of a perfect storm between being a woman, a mother, someone who didn't have a gallery representation for most of her life, and I don't know. She was maybe reviewed somewhat, but not a lot. It just seemed like uh, she was just kind of on the periphery. And then the Whitney show happened, and it kind of thrust her into the forefront. But then Hilton Kramer came along and kind of dismissed the work, and so boom, kind of back where she started again. So I think that it's if you just kind of look at what makes artists successful and in the conversation today, and then put a negative sign in front of all of those categories, that's kind of what her situation was. Would you agree? Yeah.
I would also oops. Hello? Yeah, take yours. You mentioned the Whitney show, 73. It's 70, and then there was 73, yeah. There's around that time other women that are shown, Alice Neal and Alma Thomas at the Whitney, and just like Alice Trumbull Mason, boom, they disappear for decades. Then it's a very interesting moment where the early 70s shows these really striking works at the Whitney for most. And then you think, oh, wow, that's it, they're on the map. But no, they disappear again for decades, and it's only now that they're coming back up. Yeah.
And LS Neal at least has the kind of recognizable visual branding that Jason's talking about, but I guess it doesn't
Yeah.
help
Yeah, what-
necessarily.
I saw a show of hers at Washburn, I don't know how many years ago, and I just thought, like, this work is so fresh. Like, it was just really exciting. It wasn't like moribund, historically determinist, formalist abstraction. It's kind of like what I was looking for. And that's just a personal anecdote.
It was either after the Whitney show in '73 or around that time. There was a Vivian Rayner review in the Times, and Steve, I assume you have record of this, which she concluded with saying that she dismissed Alice's work and said that the weakest part of it was that clearly she didn't suffer enough as a painter. I'm serious. Does anybody remember that? And your mother was devastated, and that kind of finished it off for the rest of the decade or two. And it was really I think it was the Whitney show. But I just want to add that with such a strong adherence to something non-objective, that whether it was biomorphic or running towards the end to something more architectural, my exposure to the paintings over the decades has been that in spite of all that, there was something that she was painting that was attached to natural phenomena. And what I mean by that is that if you stand there long enough or are around these paintings long enough, the thing that's being painted, one of the things being painted is like wind in the leaves or wind in grass or something rippling over the water, something really, really elusive and abstract, and something that's rather gentle, that's that's contrary to the kind of hard edge aspect of all these things. Anyway, that's not really a question, just an observation.
Thank you.
Mary, you had a question too? No? Okay.
I like what David just said about the inflected, well, the surfaces are inflected in a way, and I think you used the word, Will, you talked about the skin and the body. What, maybe you said that, the skin and the body of the paint. I'm just curious if there's any evidence whether she came into contact with, through exhibitions or personal introduction to Aaron Douglas, Arthur Dove, or Barnett Newman over her time, because some of the biomorphic work in the early decades, as well as the tighter abstract work, makes me think of Aaron Douglas's large-scale murals, not the figurative imagery, but the geometry in the terms of the analogous color relationships. And the biomorphic work that Will described with us harkens back to Arthur Dove, and I was thinking about their chronologies and whether she came into contact with any of that.
The only thing I can say is that she really was involved with the cultural scene at the time. She, went to concerts by John Cage. She went to hear Gertrude Stein lecture. She invited Piet Mondrian to speak to the AAA. And when you mentioned Arthur Dove, I was just at the Museum of Modern Art before I came here, and there's a room now dedicated to the Art of Our Time gallery, and it has a biomorphic Rothko, and when you mentioned Dove, I flashed onto the Rothko. I thought to myself, of course, he became famous after he ditched that, and whether or not that has a bearing on the tastes of the time, quite possibly, or on the quote unquote, which I hate the word, but branding of the artist, it could be, but there's a certain type of sublimation, I think, that and transcendence that Newman definitely evoked, that I think was also part of the taste of the time, and that she was a little bit too gritty, a little bit too of the earth, I think, than that.
Sunita?
Bringing up Newman and abstract expressionists makes me think of scale, and a lot of her paintings were quite small. And I'm just wondering if that was also the taste of the time, and it was kind of a bravado, if you weren't making big paintings, you weren't a serious painter.
I actually think that might be very much the case, and also for her generation, they didn't do huge paintings, and I think that might have been part of why the abstract expression seemed like such a supersession over what they were doing. And I misspoke, it was art of this century, not art of our time, the gallery that was represented at the museum.
Regarding the critical reception of her work, I would just note of a personal experience of being a graduate student at Hunter College in the early 80s. I was doing research on Leon Polk Smith, and there was no monograph on him. And so what one had to do was go to the library and pull out the art index and make a list of all the publications that wrote about him, either in an article or a review. And so I actually read everything written by him, about him, from 1941 up to that present time. And it was great education because I'd have to flip through pages to find what I was looking for. And of course, came across many other interesting articles and reviews. And going through the 1950s, I kept coming across reviews and articles about this person, Alice Trumbull Mason. And I thought, who is this person? And why have I never heard of her? But she seemed to be, from my perspective at that time, and looking through these publications, very well regarded. And so I just found it's an interesting contrast in terms of how we look back from the present. But at that moment, there seemed to be a great deal of attention being put on her work. But the comment or question I wanted to make really maybe has to do with the shutter paintings. And there's so much implied lateral movement in those paintings, shifting spaces, as though you have these thin interstices that have been spoken of, and figure ground relationships that can be confusing. And it makes me wonder if she had any interest in what I would call the motion graphics of the period, even if you're just thinking about Hans Richter or Saul Bass. And for me, it's also, those paintings are also reminiscent of the opening and closing credits of Monsoon Wedding by Mira Nair. And has anyone ever given any consideration to the relation of those paintings to motion graphics?
Interesting.
That's fascinating. But and I do see what you're saying, because for me they feel like accordion-like sometimes, right? They really have. And you were speaking about, you touched upon that with the kinetics of the four ways, and also this whole implied motion, right, of the painting. There's definitely something there that we need to dig in. Yeah.
Yeah, the accordion is like a diaphragm, like in her work. It feels like the nature that I see in her work is that accordion kind of expansion and contraction, but it is on a very thin lateral. It's like so laterally extensive, and it makes me think of like the idea of like kind of a negative idea of like the internet, where it's a mile wide and an inch deep, you know. And I'm not trying to define her in those terms, but it seems very modernist, like very accelerationist, even to consider like the edge that she was working with in terms of space. It's really kind of pushing the envelope.
Okay. I don't have a question, but when you showed the Mondrian painting that she copied, I was reminded of an article that I saw in The Guardian in January, which had which was discussing the use of the double horizontal lines. And the article was looking into the fact as to whether Mondrian picked up the notion of the double horizontal lines from Marlowe Moss, who was a neoplastic female artist based in St. Ives. So it was a really interesting comparison. And I think some of you might find it interesting to Google that article and find it.
It is possible, like the Marlowe. Yeah, absolutely possible that Mondrian actually got it from her.
She did not have the vertical lines go all the way through. They would end at where they met it would end where they met the horizontal lines. Mondrian's would go through as Alice did in that one. So.
I mean, I think for me, this stuff also, we can't forget that Mondrian is Dutch. And that, in the Dutch churches, you would see these kind of like diamond shapes in the 17th century, right? These diamond shapes paintings that were quite abstract and had these this presence, like icons. And I think like that's why I speak about this painting being an icon for, maybe I didn't read that line in my text, but an icon for Alice is that it is this reminder, right? This kind of icon in her studio of where it comes from. And there is in Mondrian also the Ruysdael flat country, the flatness, the horizons, these things that when you speak about Alice, sometimes you refer to Italian painting. And I think that you see in Mondrian references to 17th century landscape paintings, if you have them in mind, in a radical manner. Obviously, just like Alice radicalizes Italian primitives, but they're painting in a continuum. Despite their abstract commitment, there is a sense of the land. There is a sense of the landscape.
Mondrian's plus minus paintings
Yeah.
of the trees
That's where they come from. Right?
dissolving into line.
Yeah.
Hi. One thing I didn't get was the time period that she was painting in. What impact was going on in New York and in the world at the time? I didn't hear anything. I heard about Mondrian, but what about the rest of the European emigres that were escaping the Nazis and coming over here in New York, and the Depression and World War II had huge impacts on all these artists at the time. Do you have any reflection on that?
Well, she shared the studio. She had a Harlem studio, and at some point, Miro, like explaining her biomorphism, like Miro was literally next door to her. So she would have seen him paint, and the Albers came through, and she was also in touch with them. The whole crew of Black Mountain College teachers, like Bolotowski, and on these people were in touch with her. She was very much into relations. Like when you read the letters, it's incredible how many people she knew. And she's always speaking of them in such familiar terms. She knew everybody, and it seems like everybody knew her.
One
She
thing
was-
she did live through was the kind of the split in abstract American artists after, it was revealed that Stalin wasn't such a great guy, So the idealist communists, there was a definite like bifurcation in the organization between those who were communist and those who were not, or not card carrying. And I think just in terms of world events, that was probably very significant. I mean, the Depression, of course, had the WPA and one of the founding members, who I'm blanking on his name, was one of the organizers of the Works Progress Administration for Artists. Burgoyne Diller, right? So Burgoyne Diller was like, he was an apparatchik in the WPA, but there were conflicts. I mean, again, I remember reading something about Gottlieb. Him and his wife were giving out checks for like the WPA artists. They would come to their house, and they stopped doing it because of that whole rift, the communist. There was something to the anarchist thing, but they weren't willing to, because of world events, go with the idea of idealist communist things because of what was happening in the preview to World War II.
Do we have anything else? Any more questions? We think we have time for one or two. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, again. Thank you. Thank you to Tom McGlynn for moderation, Will Heinrich, Tom McKelly, Dr. Barbara Steele, and Cecily Kahn. Thank you.